Well, the tanks aren't even loaded onto boats to be shipped over to Europe yet, and the Pentagon is already ready to further escalate this escalatory nonsense that they are engaged in, sending ever more effective and important weapons over to the Ukrainian side in this Russo-Ukrainian war. The Ruskies already are on edge after the announcement of the tanks, particularly because from a public relations standpoint in Russia, seeing Russian troops blown up by German tanks brings back very painful memories of a war in which like 10 million Soviet citizens were killed, or maybe it was 5 million. I don't know. Once you get up into the millions, as far as deaths on one side of a war is concerned, it's all a blur to me. It's a lot. It's like with China. China in World War II, I remember that they had more losses than the Soviet Union, but again, once you get into the millions or tens of millions, it all kind of washes together in my head over time. And so imagine the outrage from the Chinese public if China were engaged in a war in which the other side were using tanks that were built and donated for free by the Japanese. That's kind of what we're talking about here. It's a very provocative situation with the tanks alone, and it's one that is going to anger the Russian public and therefore encourage the Russian government to retaliate in some way, which the Russian government has yet to do. And now we're not even giving them time to lick their wounds on the tank issue before talking about sending over F-16 fighter jets. What happened to all of Ukraine's MiGs and Su-25s? I think they also would have had. Where is Ukraine's Air Force? I don't know. Perhaps it was blown up by the Ruskies, but we're told that the Ruskies have not been effective at doing anything and that it's been the Ruskies that have been losing all of the equipment. But again, it's kind of the same story as with the tanks. It's like, well, Ukraine used to be an exporter of tanks. Where did all of the tanks go? There's kind of only one logical conclusion. And so therefore, if the tanks that were presumably blown up by the Ruskies are replaced by new American and German tanks, as well as old surplus Comblock tanks from Poland and the state formerly known as Czechoslovakia. Those tanks presumably will be blown up as well. And if the old Soviet jets that were operated by the Ukrainian Air Force, if those fighters have already been blown up to the point that they now have to rely on American F-16s, which I would have to imagine the average Ukrainian pilot has never sat in the cockpit of an F-16. I don't know a whole lot about planes, but I would think transitioning from a MiG-29 to an F-16 might come with some growing pains. For one thing, all of the writing on the inside of the cockpit and all the switches and everything would be in English, which, maybe a lot of these Ukrainian guys, maybe they do speak English, but, you're used to looking at things that have a completely different alphabet. If you're sitting in a MiG or one of these Su-25s, and everything's in your native Cyrillic, and I would imagine, you're kind of used to that. The Air Force isn't like the Army, where they can just have examples of the enemy weapons and say, hey, if you're ever in a battle and you have to pick up an enemy, a weapon off a dead enemy soldier or something like that, and use it for yourself. Here's some basic training on how to use an AK or an SKS or an SVD. Those are small, they're portable. The Army has plenty of them on hand here in the United States, and they can train their soldiers in the basic operation of small arms from all around the world, whether they be Chinese, German, Russian. When it comes to the Air Force, I don't think I've ever heard. Now, it's been a while since I've watched Top Gun, I'll admit. I didn't even see the new Top Gun sequel, so maybe I'm a little behind the times on how the Air Force operates. But I'm pretty sure that they don't have a fleet of MiGs and Su-25s on hand to train these fighter pilots on how to fly Russian jets in the case that they ever get shot down and there just happens to be a Russian jet unoccupied, in good condition, sitting nearby. And if the U.S. Air Force is not doing that kind of training, I'm fairly certain that the Ukrainian Air Force is not doing that either. I think that the Ukrainian pilots know how to fly Ukrainian planes. So if this is the case, how are they going to do it? Well, they probably will have to hire outside contractors to come in who know how to operate these jets and train their pilots, at the very least, how to use them. Now, where are the Ukrainian pilots going to train on how to use an F-16 if Ukraine is currently at war with Russia? It kind of seems like it'd be hard to train on using a fighter jet in a war zone because, while you're on your training mission, the enemy might think, hey, look, there's an enemy fighter jet in the air. Maybe we should go attack it. I don't think that the Ukrainians can just say to the Ruskies, hey, we're going to fly a training mission now because we don't really know how to use these jets, so please don't shoot us down. And so what's been speculated for a long time is that if Ukraine is provided these jets, they'll have to be, at the very least, trained in some foreign country. Let's say Poland, somewhere nearby that's not too hard for these Ukrainian pilots to get to. And if these jets, if the Ukrainians are able to successfully learn how to use them and become proficient, which, hey, let's be honest, they're fighter pilots. They should be pretty good pilots in general. And so, once somebody shows them the ropes on how an F-16 is different from their MiG, they should do a good job. They should be pretty competent. Well then, once they fly across the border back into Ukraine, wouldn't you suspect that the Ruskies would blow up these F-16s just like they blew up all of Ukraine's original Air Force, which apparently has now been depleted, and otherwise they would not need F-16s? In order for these planes to be effective then and not suffer the same fate as their Soviet-made predecessors, wouldn't they need to operate from most likely Polish airfields where they're safe, where there is not an active war zone, and then they can fly into the war zone, do their missions, and then try and get out of there and get back as fast as possible? Because I think that we've established that the Ruskies are able to bomb the west of Ukraine. Remember that viral clip of, what was his name, the MSNBC guy, Malcolm Nance. And they could hear air raid sirens, and there was some kind of noise over it, and he was saying a bunch of nonsense and doing some kind of countdown. It was a big clip for NBC News. They were very happy to get that. Well, what that indicated to me is that in the far west of Ukraine, where Lvov, Lemberg, still never been able to pick which version of that name I want to use, so I use all three. There's probably more. There's probably like 5 versions of that name. Anyway, that city in far western Ukraine, if the Ruskies were able to bomb it somehow, well then, even if you had fighter jets all the way over there, the Ruskies could still take them out, because you don't have time during an air raid to get the planes into the air and try and, fly away from wherever the bombs are falling. So all the Ruskies have to do is bomb their hangars, unless the Ukrainians can find a way to effectively camouflage these fighter jets every single day. If they could do that, well, then sure, it'd be fine to fly these out of Ukraine and, they'd carry on. But then again, if they were able to camouflage their planes and keep them from getting blown up by the Ruskies on the ground, well, then wouldn't presumably they still have all of their old planes? Or at least most of them, the ones that hadn't been blown out of the sky. And if the problem wasn't the planes getting blown up on the ground, well, then there's an even bigger issue, because that means that if these planes were getting shot out of the sky, and that's why Ukraine doesn't have any fighter planes left, well, then the same thing is going to happen here. They're in even worse shape. More fighter planes aren't going to help them if they're getting shot out of the sky. That just means that the Ruskies are better than the Ukrainians at the whole fighter jet thing. But anyway, nobody's thinking this through. Nobody actually cares about winning the war. They're just trying to keep the war going, that's all. Because they know, well, the longer the war goes on, the more resources Russia has to expend, just like in Afghanistan. And the longer the war goes on, the more money we make, because the more weapons we can ship over to Ukraine. It's great if Ukraine keeps losing weapons like this, because they're successively more and more expensive. An Abrams tank costs like, what, 10 million? An F-16 is what, like 70 million? There's nothing that Northrop Grumman and the Pentagon want to see more than for these F-16s to get blown up on the ground, but without the pilots inside them, so that there are still pilots to fly new F-16s that can be shipped over to Ukraine at a great profit to Northrop Grumman. Or I'm sorry, it's not Northrop Grumman. I think it's General Dynamics. That's who makes the F-16, right? Or what? Maybe the F-16 division, I think, was sold maybe to Boeing. Is it Boeing that? It's one of them. It's okay. Yeah, Lockheed bought the F-16 program from General Dynamics, so it is now Lockheed Martin. They're all the same as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it only matters if you own stock, if you're trying to trade stocks. I mean, other than that, the military-industrial complex is one. For the sake of, in the abstract, you don't really need to think of them as separate entities. They're only separate entities on the stock exchange, and so if, there's something like this that benefits Lockheed, you don't want to get caught, buying General Dynamics stock, because you're still thinking that they produce the F-16, and then, when Lockheed gets a bump, then you miss out on the bump, and you can't sell that, and blah, 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 but I don't trade stocks anyway. So as you would expect from the Pentagon, they're part of the revolving door that Jordan Tristan Walker talked about on that hidden camera footage. He even, directly cited the Defense Department as an example. You got all these generals who are like, hey, let's send these weapons to Ukraine. And then guess what happens? They get a nice payout by Lockheed when they retire. They get to sit on the board of Lockheed, make lots of money, and do absolutely nothing because they know nothing about business. Just like our current defense secretary, what was his name? Lloyd Austin. Lloyd Austin was on the board of Raytheon because he had retired from being a general. He went to sit on the board of Raytheon, make all his money. Now he's come back, after being a defense, on the board member of a defense contractor. Now he's back to being the defense secretary again. So Raytheon will have to boost his salary once he goes back to their board. It really is all so disgusting. This is all about money, nothing more. Although there are a lot of people who still, for some reason, genuinely believe in the cause of the great Ukrainians and how they're moral and how the Russians are evil, even though they're both authoritarian states. If your position is just, hey, I like freedom, well then Ukraine is not. They're not your friends. They should not be your chosen side. And of course, the Ruskies shouldn't be either. If that is, if that's your whole MO, which a lot of these people claim to be. They're just like, oh, well, we think Ukraine should be free. It's like, well, if you think Ukraine should be free, you definitely don't want the government in Kiev to be in charge. But there are other reasons why you could support one side or the other. I'm just saying that the typical defense of Ukraine that we hear from their American advocates is total bullshit. But anyway, the pro-Ukraine folks, the Ukraine flag abbeys, the Ukraine necktie wearers, they believe that, you know, we should just give Ukraine anything and everything, unlimited budget works, and there will be no consequences from Russia. Russia, they're a bunch of pussies, and Putin would never do anything. You know, he's a big chicken. That's what they keep telling me. You know, we should just keep picking on him, and he'll never punch back. The only way that Putin would ever do anything is if, you know, the U.S. directly invaded Russia. It's like, okay, well, we're coming kind of close to that. You know, don't you think that that's the whole idea of escalation? Is you're getting closer and closer to a conflict. You're saying, well, there wouldn't be any conflict unless we actually crossed this line. And it's like, okay, well, you seem to be comfortable getting right up to that line. I don't want to get anywhere near that line, because once we get up to that line, I know that you'll want to cross it. But even so, I don't know that that's where Putin's line is. I'm not a mind reader. I'm not one of these Kremlinologists who claim to understand the inner workings of, you know, Putin's brain. And of course, that's all that matters. You know, Putin is not like, it's not like Putin exists in a broader system. It's not like he's one man out of a nation of like 120 million people. No, Putin is Russia, and Russia is Putin. It's a hive mind, all controlled by him, and whatever he says goes. This is what, you know, the Western wizards of smart want us to believe. They don't want us to believe that Putin is at all pressured or influenced by other people in his country, such as constituents or, you know, other members of what used to be called the Politburo, what now I think is called the Security Council. But, you know, I guess we'll continue that another day. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.